Welcome today to our latest in our webinar series. Today we'll be talking about building an OT security foundation with asset inventory and an eye towards asset management. Anybody can buy technology and get insight, but actually doing something about it is really the objective. We're going to talk a little bit today about building a more useful context. We're going to talk a lot about automation. We're going to talk about adding multiple dimensions to your analysis so you're not looking at a single indicator of risk. I mean, as I walked into a plant one day to do an assessment, a plant manager told me, look, I don't change passwords and I don't patch. I already know that. How are you going to help me? It's a great question without context about what you should do and how urgently you need to do it. That's a little bit tough to consider boiling the ocean, but we can't do nothing either. So today, hopefully we'll walk through some of those. With me today, my very capable colleague, Natalie Kalinowski. We're going to share the presentation duties. And let's go ahead and get to it. If you have any questions throughout it, please feel free to use the Q&A. We do have some questions that some of you submitted ahead of time. We'll try to get to those by the end. But for now, let's go ahead and get going. At the end, you will be given a follow-up email thanking you for attending with a link to the recording, as well as an invitation to our next webinar, August 27th, where my colleague Marc Etienne from the risk and consulting perspective will be walking through recent ICS advisories and alerts and what that's how that's changing the landscape. So it's always a very well attended one. Of course, they all are insightful, but make sure you sign up for that one as well. So without further ado, today you've got two speakers here. You've got myself, Rick. I've been with Verve for about 8 years now, but I've been in OT security for about 23, 24 years. I have worked with large and small companies ranging from Matricon and Verve to larger companies like Honeywell and Rockwell, which has afforded me the privilege of being able to see all sizes and shapes of industries, all sizes and shapes of companies within those industries, different geographies, and the good, the bad, and the ugly efforts and results that some of those turn into. Hoping to share some of those insights with you today. I brought with me Natalie Kalinowski, very capable technical resource, engineering program at Rockwell, very capable in this topic and emerging threats. So today, hopefully, we're going to be able to share with you some key learnings from what we're seeing in the market and trends and what's working for people that are accelerating and winning the battle, as it were. To start the backdrop and why we're here today, I mean, obviously ICS threats are growing rapidly, both from targeted and non-targeted attacks. They know this is table stakes. Everybody's here because security is an important thing, but of note, not only have the frequency and the volume of risks escalated, we are starting to see first evers, right? So the first ever, active exploit of a PLC. I mean, there's many that have used PLC components to be able to gain entry into a network, or to gather additional intelligence, but they're now pivoting to actually using PLC knowledge and some of those protocols to actually attack operational equipment. Again, you'll hear more about that August 27th, but the idea is that not only is there more of them in general, there's more of them in particular for OT as well. The other challenge, though, is that to increase security, we can't just look at a single indicator. We don't just want perimeter monitoring. We don't want a hard and crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. We need to have a multidimensional view of security, a multidiscipline view. The defense in depth spans people, process, and technology. But what are we building towards, and how do we know we've got there, right? So what's your target and your objective? In other words, what does done look like? In almost every case, regardless of your maturity and where you are along the path, progress really begins with an assessment of where we are and what are the next steps. Whether you're doing this in an automated fashion, like many of our clients are, and when I mean automated, I mean they've got a real-time view into current risk, and so they can see the ebbs and flows as new risks come out, or as risks are addressed through patching and system hardening and compensating controls. We always need to be assessing where we are and how we're tracking. Are we falling behind? Are we making progress? As the clock ticks by, more and more devices get towards end of life. Maybe we're ticking towards an outage or an update that we can take some systems offline and do some work. But it's always a continual reassessment of where we are and how we're doing. To achieve future state, the topic of IT and OT and convergence is such a huge discussion anywhere and everywhere. You can't go to trade show without discussing it. The reality is you need skill sets from both, and cross-training one to be the other is I think well-intentioned but hard to do. And you've already got really capable and very experienced skill sets in each of those environments. If we can build a structure within which they collaborate, we leverage those instantly, much more easily and much more effectively. The way that's facilitated is, as we've seen, if you want to talk about success in the industry, it is a think global, act local perspective. We'll talk more about that today. The basic premise is if we can take that scarce set of resources, IT and OT together, to look collectively at the fleet across consistent indicators and multi dimensions of compromise or potential exposure, we start to build much more consistent and precise reaction and remediation. But at its foundation, it is all powered by, do we know what we have and do we know how it's configured? Because if you have gaps in that, like the old story about if you're off here by an inch, you'd be in the ditch, you're off by a mile once you're down the road. We need to make sure that we have a solid foundation with which to build. So based on that, today, we're going to talk a little bit about the objective of today's presentation. We want to leave you with some takeaways, whether you're a very mature organization that has tools that you're having varying degrees of success with, or whether you're just starting out or you're somewhere in between. We want to give you some things to think about. Why is getting it right so critical? I sort of alluded to that just now. The reality is, we typically go into different places that have done maybe some easy button attempts at trying to understand inventory or going to secondary data sources to build an inventory and finding their actual gaps in the inventory. Well, those are gaps that could potentially be your undoing. And so we're not trying to be bulletproof. We're not pretending that if you listen to us, nothing will ever happen, but we do want to make sure that we truly understand our scope and can minimize the impact and get back to normal as soon as possible. We're going to talk a little bit about the key challenges. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges in this space, and then I'm going to throw it to Natalie, who's going to talk through some of the successes of adopting some of these scenarios. So I'm going to set up why the scenarios are important and challenging, and then Natalie's going to hopefully walk through, if you get them right, how powerful that is. And then some suggestions near the end is, depending on where you are maturation-wise, where do you want to start and what do you want to focus on? So the key takeaways for today would be, let's think ahead, okay? Throughout this presentation, what is your definition of inventory? If you want to take a second just to sort of mentally tick that off your box here, what you think inventory is, and we're going to come back to that. I'm going to see if you've changed your mind at all when we get there. I certainly hope so. The other thing we want to make sure that we're aware of is that when we're trying to assess risk, and this isn't a new concept, but it's not necessarily talked about a lot, an IT practice typically assumes that everything is homogeneous in Windows 10 or 11, and you can patch on a Tuesday, and you can have standards around software and configuration and users. Well, all bets are off when you get to OT because we have varying different levels of legacy and fragility and proprietary or third-party software, stuff that's not typically seen in IT, stuff that's not built for mass production or mass update or cloud-based updates. And there's certainly different ramifications in that space. And so we invariably have to go from if then, and I've got a pretty good illustration on the next slide as to what exactly that looks like. The way to navigate that is to understand as much as you can about the asset. And so already I hope I'm pushing your concept of what an inventory is outside of just what's on the asset, but it's patch levels, its vulnerability, its antivirus status, but also its function to operations. One thing you absolutely must take from this is that you cannot just trust what you hear. Again, if we rely just on traffic or third-party data like maintenance databases, we are not going to the source. We're not truly understanding what's there. Super quick example of going to the endpoint, large refining client. We turned on these endpoint approach. We found 47 dormant administrative accounts. All of them belong to departed employees. Not a single one of them is being transmitted because they're not actively being logged into, but every single one of them is an admin level account that could be exploited if something got in. You do miss data if you don't go inspect. And I use the analogy of, do you want to be the police, which would be the equivalent of the state trooper on the overpass with a radar gun doing the listing part, versus do you want to be the Department of Transportation, accessing driver logs and maintenance logs and being able to do inspections and understanding odometer and brake levels, et cetera. I think the answer is the latter. Back to the think global. The other thing you need to make sure you're thinking about in any program build is eventually you need to do something about what you find. So a very large, long list of vulnerabilities, while interesting, unless we know what to do or what we should do and how fast we should do it or how we're going to do it, we've really only scratched the surface in solving that problem. And because there's so much fluidity and evolution in the risk, and unfortunately a lack of resources, as much as we can automate for data collection and analysis or scoring, the better off we will be in trying to keep up. So these are the takeaways. We'll revisit them in a bit. But let's first start with what are we starting at? So if we haven't done this, or we started to do this, you've learned this the hard way. Starting with an inventory, or that being your first objective, is a lot like the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's pretty straightforward. For those of you who aren't, the premise is that the writer hands the mouse a cookie, offers him a cookie. The mouse says, "Oh, that's great, but I'm kind of thirsty now. Could I have a glass of milk to wash it down?" So we fetch the glass of milk, and then they're wondering, perhaps there's some crumbs in my whiskers. Can I look in the mirror? And then they see that their hair is askew. So they want scissors to do some trimming, etc. The idea is, when you give a board a metric, maybe the other way to do it, we have an inventory, we have vulns perhaps. The idea is it's you start that path, and it's going to quickly get to a future state. So if we can get out ahead of it, not only to manage our own objective in terms of truly understanding risk, but also being able to manage expectations and reporting, but more importantly, being able to take that same data and go back to get budget support, et cetera. So why is it so hard in OT? I alluded to it a moment ago. This is from our very capable OT engineering group of people in the ISA 99 or IEC 62443. There was a patching subcommittee that built what they called the patch urgency decision tree. And if you look at this in OT, again, very different than IT. First thing you need to do is identify vulnerability, just the tip of the iceberg, like I just said. But of course, we immediately see, does it affect ICS? And if not, well, then I'm going to continue operations. Already we're including the notion that we understand the systems in scope and what their impact is to operations. If it does impact a particular control equipment or line or system, is there a workaround available? And if the answer is yes, we're going to schedule for another day and we're going to go back to work, right? So we're starting to add additional components of understanding, but we're also seeing that we have all these if-then scenarios within an OT space. But here's the third one. If it does actually impact operations and there's not necessarily a workaround, we need to be able to answer this question. Do the operational needs outweigh the risk? To do that, we need to understand much more, not only about the vulnerability, but about the asset itself. Not only its impact to operations and how important it is to you, but what other compensating controls might you have in place that allow you to descale the risk for now, because you've got multiple layers of network defense, you've got a hardened system, you've got a recent backup, what have you. This analysis to be able to make this decision is only improved with the more data sources and data points you can get. And this is a significant oversight for many organizations. Maybe not in general that they don't know they need to know more than one component, but how they gather it and how they present it and navigate it. So we're going to talk about a lot more today. So taking the mouse and the cookie analogy to what we just talked about, here is a much more succinct thing that you could probably get a little more related to, since we're talking about OT security. It absolutely starts fundamentally with what we have and what the vulnerabilities and patches are associated with what we have. But then how are those devices configured? Like I said, those 47 dormant admin accounts, wide open guest accounts, remote access enabled everywhere, for example, user accounts and shared accounts, et cetera. Third-party protection. What do we have for network segmentation? Where are we in the network? What do we have for fallback? In the world of OT, even if there is an intruder, it's interesting. IT would want to track and trace and grab forensics. OT wants to nuke them and get back to good. So that's why we have a very rudimentary but powerful, fail, get back to last known good, get back up and running. But it all hinges upon this. We're not going to have the same level of backup and restoration practice with redundant systems or supporting systems like file servers as we will with critical safety systems and HMIs, et cetera. So this is what we want to try and build. I'm going to show a little bit of a case study of a power client right now as to how they started to build it. And then Natalie's going to walk through some of the benefits from it. I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges, and Natalie's going to talk a little bit about overcoming the challenges and what the benefit looks like. So we do have a power client. We have multiple power clients, but this particular one had multiple generation facilities. Traditional North American coal-based, so 70s, 80s were the original built. So 50, 60 years old. Multiple acquisitions and different projects mean a little bit of everything in the environment. There was a central headquarters support team that also helped to report up and down externally. Of course, some of these are regulated locations. As a corporate mandate, they needed to understand and secure all assets against CSC 20. So this is a bit of a journey that they had, some basic building blocks around their CSIP, but they were really trying to get to a much more mature standard. For those of you not familiar with CSC, it's now called CSC 18, but it does have maturity levels within these different categories. Category 1 is, do you have a hardware inventory? Category 2 is, do you have a software inventory? Then you want to label those for their impact to operations. So any program and effort starts with inventory, but requires multiple data sources. Like I said, a single indicator of risk like vulns or patches is interesting, but not necessarily this full story. For example, I've got 800 missing patches, but the vendor only supports applying 200 of them. What am I doing with the other 6? So that example for them is, how do they prioritize remediation? So this is what sort of stemmed or started their overall journey. Of course, they needed to get to CSC, but they wanted to better understand the reason why they want to go CSC is to understand how they prioritize remediation. And as you can see, we need to know multiple indicators, not just the vulnerability one I just showed now about patch urgency. Can we do it now? Can we do it later? But risk in general. So taking it up a level, understanding the vulnerability, accessibility of that device, where it is in the Purdue model, where it's remotely, whether it's physically at a particular location, how that device is configured, what its criticality is to operations, what the vulnerability itself says, right? And so these are some of the challenges we have to being able to prioritize collecting these components and cross-referencing them back to the actual asset itself. Now, they started with a pretty detailed inventory, and they started to build in components. These were all challenges, of course, that they were able to overcome. Detailed inventory of different types of OSs, because as soon as you get into OT and see, my colleague likes to call them working museums, older versions like XP and Server 2003, and sometimes even NT, you have a different dimension to risk, right? That end of life and the lack of supportability, et cetera. You may want to be able to, quite often we see use cases that require pivoting to a specific vendor. So you may have Windows boxes underlying all your HMIs, but you have multiple vendors. You need to wait for vendor 1 versus vendor 2 versus vendor 3 to support that patch. And so being able to sub-filter to those subsets of data allow you to, rather than accept everybody until all the patches are in, or do nothing, or at least proactively go at those who are getting you information in a timely manner. Of course, outside of what's actually on the endpoint and what might be coming from the vendor, the system itself, what is its context to safe operations? Getting a head around these sorts of things and being able to pull that in is a significant indicator to risk and helping to increase or decrease your urgency. And if you can eventually get to incorporating multiple of these indicators, presence of vulnerabilities, presence of whitelisting or backup status, asset criticality, vendor support for a patch, we can then start to calculate a contextual risk. And Natalie's going to go through that a lot more, so I'm not going to belabor it here. But the value comes from, and again, some of the takeaways, how deep and extensive is your inventory? Do we understand, and only from the hardware and its impact, the software that's installed and how many of them and what version and where exactly they are? We had a client, that same power generation client, was asked to remove all foreign built antivirus software. If you can imagine the complexity of 6 coal-fired facilities in 5 different states, trying to understand if there are hundreds and hundreds of HMIs, how many versions of that software was and where to find them, it becomes needle in a haystack sometimes for some people. And of course, anybody can get a long list of vulnerabilities. Natalie's going to talk through a little bit more about this, but this is not uncommon. We recently did a vulnerability analysis of a large midstream gas company, and we literally found 23,917 vulnerabilities. And while that's a very interesting number and very thorough in its nature, it is actually relatively useless in and of itself, because you will never take that 23,000 down to 0. And you will never just start at the top of the list. There are ways to sort this. Natalie will walk you through how this organization did this. But it's very, very powerful when you have the ability to focus. And also to help you understand what done looks like. If we can't get it to 0, how far do we get it? How far do we want to push it? Patching is another area where we want multiple indicators of risk, and is a challenge for many orgs. Looking at patching, the raw list of patches versus the subset that are approved by the vendor versus those that have been tested. And then when you look on another dimension, those patches that are available, which systems are in scope for them? Do we have some that we can test on, like redundant file servers or domain controllers, before I go to secondary or primary HMIs or safety systems? So patching takes on a whole other level of dimension and complexity when you want to start to look at, well, okay, I have patches, but where do they belong? In which order should I do them in? Or can I do them? Or should I do them? So I'm hoping that through those last 5 or 6, slides talking about vulnerability, hardware, software, and patching, that I've energized, and we're going to go back and revisit mentally, collectively, what exactly is an inventory. And my colleague is going to step into more detail exactly what's in the inventory and what you absolutely should have. But these are, of course, some components to it. However, Natalie's going to show us a couple other dimensions over and above. Couple notes. Inventory that is built on a summer intern and then change control to keep it up over time has been found to be very problematic. Inventory that is built from third-party data sources or traffic analysis are also potentially short-sighted. We need to be continually updating and verifying our inventory. And we also need to understand far beyond what we get from the asset. So that's about as big a preamble and a setup as I can for you, Natalie. Why don't you go ahead and take it from here?
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'll just keep going right away. So what is the scope of your asset inventory? So of course, the first step is having accurate information, but also having real-time information on your devices. But once you have all that accurate and real-time information, it also generates a ton of noise. You might have too much information and it can paralyze your team from taking any quick or efficient actions to solve them. And then how do you contextualize that risk for your OT environment, like that flow chart Rick was showing us earlier. So that's where we want to step in and show you the benefits on how you can overcome those challenges and bridge that gap between the metadata you're collecting from your devices and then how you can build that organizational context in your OT environment. So the way we found success is first you look at that asset specific information. So you look at that high level information like the manufacturer, model, serial number of the devices, and then you dig in deeper on information on the current firmware and software in the devices, as well as running config files on these OT type devices. And then after that, we continue dialing deeper into these devices and looking at the asset specifics. We look at the asset specifics, and then we move on to the context in which that asset is working. Is it a PLC or a switch, or is it a sensor? We want to start considering the operational context that these devices have and what impact they might have. Like, do they have network dependencies, or are they involved in the safety of on-site employees? And then, like Rick mentioned, we have to consider the third-party support, which is where we're looking at information on all these assets and mapping them to these exploits and vulnerabilities based on metrics coming from databases like the National Vulnerability Database or CISA alerts, information coming from AV and whitelisting status. So when you consider all these interactions, going from the high level and digging deeper into these devices. That's how we figure out how a single device can affect your OT environment all around it. So essentially, to have a successful inventory, it isn't just about having more data about these devices. It's about knowing how to apply that data to your OT environment and then be able to act on it. So I mentioned knowing how to apply that data to your OT environment. And so the way we find success is through this assessment and by contextualizing that risk. So within these boxes, you see how we essentially can break down each piece and become more successful at understanding an OT environment. So you, of course, start with the asset type. I mentioned it before, so it's as simple as checking, using this tribal knowledge and seeing what is the criticality of that device. Is it a PLC or a switch, or is it a small sensor? What is it doing in your OT environment? Next, we add criticality components, which is when we're checking the device to see if it has those network dependencies or if it's hosting other OT applications. And then finally, we add risk components, which is, again, looking at those databases, the NVD, the CISA databases, and we're also considering the patch status of these devices. So all of these metrics, when you combine them, give you a fuller picture. So you're not just looking at these vulnerabilities and exploits from, a humongous list of 20,000 something that Rick mentioned. Instead, you're, again, contextualizing that risk so you can make decisions on which of these vulnerabilities will actually impact your OT environment. And then all that information I just mentioned, it narrows down into that raw unmitigated score. So the last thing we always want to check for and to become more successful is looking at whitelisting, backups, Those are all things that will factor into the equation. So when you're comparing two devices that have similar issues, knowing whether one of them has backups can be a decision changer on whether you focus on that device or a different device. So having that contextual awareness of these devices, where they're functioning, what support and tools they have with them, really helps you more effectively manage your OT cybersecurity posture and roadmaps. So yeah. So what options does your team have? Well, first you have that manual approach, which at its most basic is when your team is tracking using that summer intern, Rick, or maybe someone who's constantly checking these devices and updating this information in an active spreadsheet, which although it's useful, it doesn't give you any real-time data on your devices. It depends completely on human activity and updating that information on devices. And there's a huge labor cost involved in even just mapping these devices to the active vulnerabilities or exploits that may be found. The next option is using a passive listening tool. So that's essentially where you would sit on a span or a tap port and listen to the information and then present that inventory list. But in this case, you don't really have a lot of insight into your actual devices because you want to go to the source and find that information, because inherently when you have vulnerabilities, the CVE, CVSS scores, those are always mapped to the actual vulnerability within a device, not to packets of information going back and forth between devices, because that's not helpful. And then another aspect of it is being able to see embedded devices, because if you're just passively looking for information, you don't really dive deeper into that OT environment where we have embedded devices, where you have to go through a backplane of a rack to find slots and cards. So that really means that it leads us all to this last solution, which is the agent and agentless combination approach. Which this solution allows you to use an agent for your OS assets, but then an agentless solution for your OT type assets. So when we say agentless, that means that the solution doesn't require you to download any additional software onto your devices. Instead, you communicate directly to these devices, which first of all means you're going directly to the source, you're getting more information from the devices, but it also means that it's safer, because when we're communicating to the devices, we have a more direct approach. So when we're communicating to the device, we use the native protocol. So we're communicating to the device in the language that it understands. And that way you're not bogging down the network by constantly scanning everything. Instead, you're only taking information when you need it for the purposes you need to look at the asset in the context of the OT environment. And yeah, so if you could switch to the next slide. All right, so key challenges in getting visibility into your OT environment. Well, first you have to work with remote locations that might not be the easiest to access. Like I mentioned before, you have to consider embedded devices. And with that, we should not have to scan your OT environment like an IT network, because in certain environments, there are changes occurring, so you have to account for that too. And last of all, none of us has unlimited OT cybersecurity staff as much as we wish we would, which is why you need a tool that can enable your team to take these actions in a consistent and efficient manner. So then your next key challenge is integrating these endpoint software data with all these vulnerabilities and patches, all these tools. So the manual effort of getting all these CVEs, CVSS scores would, and then line it up with the CPEs, it's a lot of effort that you wouldn't need to do if you had a tool to enable you. So then what that means is that when you have vendor approved patches, and then maybe you're considering, are they comprehensive? Do they factor in all the contextual risks within your specific OT environment? That's where, again, we go back to that contextualizing the risk and then deciding which of these vendor approved patches apply to your environment, when are they necessary, and when should you actually apply them. So then next, aligning asset risk with asset criticality or impact. So I've touched on this earlier, but again, in an OT environment, we have to, again, contextualize that risk. And then finally, when you have those compensating controls, like we saw in those squares showing us that algorithm for how we prioritize that risk, considering tools like AV, whitelisting, backups. It would be really helpful if all these tools were able to communicate to each other and if they're integrated, because currently, you're facing the challenge where getting accurate real-time data on the status of those tools is not an easy task. So what we want to do is enable you to leverage all these tools in one single platform. All right, so how can we overcome all those challenges and then all these pain points? So we know that assets are changing depending on your environment. We know that OT risks aren't going away, and if anything, they're becoming more serious. We know that OT assets can be difficult to find and profile, especially if we're talking about embedded assets. And finally, we know that going to the source of the data is always better to get a more accurate analysis. So the conclusion we reach is that in an asset and risk management tool, we need automation. We need the ability to navigate those complex networks so that we can be aware of the risk to operations. Because if we're using a scan-based tool, especially when we're working with fragile or sensitive devices, it's not going to help us because it can disrupt operations. So finally, with all those pieces of the pie, we need to be able to apply that context so that when we're communicating to devices, we're communicating to them in a language they understand in a way that won't disrupt operations and will allow us to work in our OT environment. So what are our practical learnings? Sorry, give me one sec. So looking at this side, we first realized that risk is subjective and that it must be paired with the impact or consequence. Actually, I think you might have skipped one slide really quick. There we go. Thank you. So what are our practical learnings? Well, first we learned that risk is subjective and that it must be paired with the impact or consequences, as well as the likelihood of an event occurring. Next, we realized that at a database level, we need to map our vulnerabilities directly to the assets. And then when that result is a bunch of noise, we need to apply that context so that we can, because we realize that not all OT assets are created equal. So now we can switch to the next slide. So earlier, Rick showed this slide where we have an entire list of information on all these assets. So I wanted to, again, remind you that when you have all this data, and then you map all that data to the vulnerability and exploits that are on your devices, you get a large number like what you see here. So what we now want to do is help you contextualize that risk and then narrow it down. So you see what happens when we go to the next slide, when we filter down this huge piece of information into just these 17 vulnerabilities that we need to focus on. So how did we get to this number? So what is the benefit of this filtering method where we're contextualizing this risk? So first we focused only on the critical vulnerabilities. So critical vulnerabilities that apply to your OT environment. Next, we're only looking at high impact assets. So assets that can affect the availability of your operations. And then we're also checking of those high impact assets, which of them currently do not have a backup. Because of course, in that case, they are more of a critical problem if something goes wrong. And then finally, we check where their whitelisting status is and if it's not currently in lockdown. So when you add all these filters and then you're using this contextualized risk, you take that number from the 20,000 vulnerabilities down to 17. And then this is something that your team can act on. This gives you that starting point or reference point so you can protect your OT environment and then be prepared for events that could occur depending on the likelihood of the vulnerability. All right. So what are our learnings after seeing some of these tools in action? Well, we know that putting context to the data is key. In certain cases, we also learned that patching is not always an option in an OT environment. So we need to learn how to mitigate OT cybersecurity risk using alternative actions. And thus, the result is also that we need to be looking at the real-time risk to your system, because often what we see is that customers will get a risk assessment or someone will generate a PDF report of their OT environment and tell them everything that's wrong and everything they have to solve. But that's not going to cut it anymore, because that just tells them about their problems at one point in time. And then what happens the next day when your environment changes, because risks are evolving and changing. So if you act now to use tools where you're able to have a real-time accurate analysis of your environment, you can, again, prevent against emerging threats or threats that have happened, like Bluekeep, which affected all those older versions of Windows OS and could spread through your system as a worm. So again, using this active approach where you're constantly looking at the real-time information on your assets and then contextualizing it will be a much more powerful tool than just a one-time PDF that you got a year ago and no one really knows what to do with it. All right, so all this visibility that you'll have into your system leads you to that comprehensive risk assessment. So essentially what you want to do is take a programmatic approach and consider all of these aspects in order to secure your OT environment. So of course, you need to be aware of policies and procedures, your network architecture, the separation between your OT and IT network. We also have to consider access control, like Rick mentioned, because we've all seen those shared passwords in OT environments, the default passwords that no one changed, and more. And finally, most importantly, we're always looking at the endpoints themselves. Again, we contextualize their risks. We want to be aware of all the gaps. So if there is, we want to track information relating to their current status, their compliance status, logs and backups. All this information will lead you to that programmatic approach where you're not just looking at one piece of information. Instead, you're looking at each asset and your entire system through multiple lenses. So think global, act local. So Rick mentioned this earlier, but I'll just dive a little more deeper in now that we have the picture to match the conversation. So working in OT environments, we aren't just worried about a single site usually. Sometimes we have multiple buildings or multiple facilities. And when you're managing multiple sites, you need information. And the first line of defense is your local team, where giving them the power to have insight into their own operations will allow them to have a better idea of where they're standing, what is their security posture in just their one location. But then when you scale that and you have more locations that you're worrying about, you might not have a cybersecurity team at each of your locations. And that's where your subject matter experts really come into play. So enabling them to have access to information on all of your sites so that they can make sure that your actions are consistent and efficient across all your sites. So that means that you don't have a single site that's maybe falling behind in its security posture, or a couple of sites that are, moving ahead, but then leaving everyone behind in the dust. So having that single pane of glass for all this information will really help your team make sure that everything is progressing at a similar pace so that nothing is being left behind. And then at the top, when you have all that information to have a scaled analysis, aggregating all the information is really helpful because it allows you to make decisions at a programmatic level, like how to set up your systems and processes to make sure that, for example, your network designs for firewalls are consistent across all your sites, or that your backups are done in a timely and consistent manner. And most of all, that you're tracking this information so that you can keep up with it and prove that you are keeping up with your security posture and your security program. All right, so last slide before I toss it back over to Rick. So after thinking globally and acting locally, I mentioned that we need to be able to track this information. So you want to be able to prove that you're taking these actions on these devices. So, which is why when you're looking at a programmatic view and breaking it down into a few metrics, you can consider these aspects. So you can check what is your average exposure across all of your assets. You can check the critical patches by asset name or asset type. And then all this tracking information will help your team not only monitor your current state, but also see trends across your entire environment. So these are all the successes we see of adopting the contextualized risk, having that single pane of glass, and then combining all these tools together. So with that, I'll throw it back over to Rick. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Natalie. Just going to wrap up, and then we get a few questions. I already see one in the QA. I'll get to you right away here, Ron. So as Natalie pointed out, there's some significant power in the ability to filter down from thousands to 17, and then the next round would be, the next set of vulnerabilities. But now the benefit is that we're addressing, just to summarize some of what you went over, we're able to hyper focus on the biggest issues, the most critical systems, the most critical vulns with the biggest exposure. We can then go to successive efforts and continue to reduce our risk, but it also allows us to figure out where we want to stop, because we're never going to, again, get it down to zero, but we want to have a level of comfort that we're okay with. If you look back at those slides, which you show the different hierarchies, different levels had different concerns, green, yellow, orange, red. You could also have different behaviors tied to them. And then when you get to the assessment portion, because we're taking the effort to get so many of these different indicators, like its configuration status, its patch status, its end of life status, its lifecycle management, et cetera, that allows you not only to bring them together for the analysis, but it also allows you to dive deep into each of those individual pursuits as you go proactively to start to weed out the various risk and weak links, if you will, in your organization. So how do we get there from here? If you haven't started, it's easy. I got an idea for you. We'll know where to start, but nobody's done nothing yet. So how do we get there? There is value in effort that has happened already. We don't want to throw it out. There will be some overlap. Maybe we want to retire things and migrate them into a single platform so we have better visibility and better ability to navigate between them, rather than becoming our own software engineers and pulling things like Power BI to try and extract data from multiple sources. There are tools like the one we typically talk about that bring it together natively off the shelf. The way to get there, though, is to first design what's your desired inventory. And we've challenged you a few times today to make sure you understand what an inventory means to OT, what you may need or what you don't need. And the idea would be then to look at your existing tool sets and your programs to decide how far off from that desired or ultimate inventory might be. We want to identify and prepare to capture any existing work at all possible. Many organizations have done lots of manual effort for inventory, and it's not just what's at the endpoint. There's a lot of operational knowledge or tribal knowledge in those databases. And while the endpoint may change or stray from what's in my record that's manually kept, its impact to operations, its physical location, its functional purpose, et cetera, don't change. We don't want to throw that IP out. So that metadata can always be captured and repurposed. Third-party data probably isn't in most people's inventory, at least not automatically today, but we want to try and grab that IP and see if there's ways to stitch that into what we've got. Third-party risk or threat intel, guaranteed your organization is aware of it and has it, but working towards mapping that. Again, we have lots of experience in doing this for clients. We have a platform that actually automatically builds all these and has existing connections. If we want to help you migrate to that, we certainly can. But then it allows you to build, once you have that multidimensional department-specific reporting, you can solicit support and information and benefits to multiple divisions. This could be lifecycle management. This could be compliance. This could be corporate. This could be pure risk. The benefit of stopping and making sure we know what we have and building a better mousetrap, as it were, is that we then benefit more people and therefore we get more support typically. So summary today is, again, summary, we'll do some key takeaways and then an invitation to our next, and I'll turn to some of the questions. Inventory is the key to everything, but inventory is only as good as the data you collect. Garbage in, garbage out, gaps in users, gaps in software, gaps in systems, the number of nested PLCs we see with a chassis with an ENBT card, another subnet. I mean, those are key and critical components that have grown over time and are very typical in older facilities that add new functions and features over time, but were never actually built at the time to be easily accessible. We want to get to those, and we can. We need to cover multiple parameters. We need the depth of data, and we need to cover all assets. OT context is absolutely paramount to risk management. Cannot tell you that the IT staff and the skill sets that are available on the security side is significant, but without the scar tissue of having worked in OT and the potential impact of an outage or a misstep, they absolutely have to be paired at the hip. And the best way to do that is with that think global, act local scenario. We can actively look at what's out there. One of our mining clients the other day was told by a vendor they don't support the decom patch, but they didn't want to live with the risk, and IT helped them analyze the risk. Found that it was just a couple of registry edits. They then decided to proactively test it on some redundant systems because they had that access and they had that visibility. Found it was safe and effectively remediated the risk without the patch. Now, when the patch does come out, they will address it. But in that instance, they're able to proactively take risk off the board with an IT-OT combination and visibility into their assets where you share that skill set. Static and transactional data are equally important. We talked a lot today about status of vulnerabilities and cross-referencing data. We also want to see when behaviors start to erupt. I mean, those traffic cops and that traffic analysis, absolutely fundamental tool set. It's wonderfully helpful for understanding traffic behaviors and deviations from it. We would caution against, banking all your reputation on it being your de facto and exhaustive inventory or vulnerability mapping, though. We do want to tie them together because together is better. The ability to act, anybody can go collect data and buy technology. Being able to provide context and do something about it is important. And remember, we always want to be going back to the source. We talked about this earlier. These environments are actually much more static than we'd like to believe. So what are some of the key takeaways? Think ahead. What are you going to do with an inventory? If you look simply today at this tree, you won't understand the forest. If we look today at inventory for the simple sake of planning a backup solution, we won't necessarily gather the data we need for secure remote access or for lifecycle management or system configuration or hardening or what have you. You need to integrate multiple data sources to give you multiple benefits. The most immediate one is risk analysis and contextual risk, but the follow-on ones are proactive hardening, proactive lifecycle management, proactive network segmentation, proactive backup and restoration and restore points. And that means we get asset data, we get third party from external sources, and then we get operational context. Those three dimensions are critical. Don't trust what you hear, go right to the source. Think about remediation, and where possible, we want to automate as much as possible. So if you can have these, then I think we've done our job today. I'm going to put up our contact information and do one more plug for our upcoming webinar, August 27. Again, it's about current risks in the ICS threat portfolio and in the wild, delivered by one of our very capable colleagues, Marc Etienne, former Big Four that does nothing but risk analysis and risk tracking. August 27th, you will get an email follow-up thanking you for attending today with a link to this recording, as well as a link to sign up for the other one if you want. We'll make it nice and easy for you. Now, we did get at least one question in the Q&A. We had some previously submitted ones when people were registering. The one in the Q&A today, what is the difference between Verve and Factory Talk Asset Center? So for those of you who are aware, Rockwell has a database or an inventory type of tool set called the Factory Talk Asset Center. It was originally built, there's two dimensions with it significantly different on Verve. One is that Asset Center was primarily built for Rockwell Kit. They are expanding to support, friendlies like Schneider equipment, et cetera. But it was originally built for managing all of those PLCs and relays and VFDs, et cetera. So there is a heavy emphasis on maintenance, on ladder logic check-in. There is some vulnerability mapping. There is ties to other data sources from the Asset Center that include playbooks for updating firmware. As you know, on a PLC, you don't just flash the single device. There's often some precursor work and some follow-on work, et cetera. But what Asset Center is not is all of these other components around risk analysis for regulatory reporting. It's not necessarily other vendors and versions of OEMs, et cetera. Verve was built primarily for inventory into security for OT. Now, there is overlap, and there is a roadmap now that Verve is part of Rockwell to incorporate the best of both worlds. One of the first things we're doing in the very near term is going to be able to pull back the backup and ladder logic status of all the Rockwell PLCs into some of those risk analysis calculations you just saw. So instead of relying just on OS type of backups or snapshots of networking gear, we can now extend the backup status in risk calculations to firmware and ladder logic check-ins. The next layer of integration that we're working on would be to pull in some of those playbooks that come from the PCDC, which is the data center for Rockwell that talks about PLC updates and those precursors and follow-ons I just mentioned. So the next evolution would be you can look at a risk on how many PLCs you have and whether they were recently checked in, but you can also see what work level and output it will take to correct them and address them. So we're wanting to bring those playbooks to your fingertips. And then the third would be potentially helping to use that same remediation that Verve offers today into the OS-based devices and extending that to doing some of the precursor work or even the actual firmware updates if so chosen, of course, under controlled circumstances. So we're looking towards the future and wanting to evolve the practice in the market in general in extending not only the analysis, but the remediation to the PLCs as well. I hope that helps, Ron. If you wanted to dig deeper, just feel free to grab my email there, shoot me a note, and I'll spin something up with you. I think we have time for one more, and we'll give people a few minutes back just in the top of the hour to get to the next meeting. Looking at some of the pre-loaded questions. Natalie, did you want to maybe talk a little bit about this one? How do you balance between security and OT? Where do you typically see compromise or acceptance, right? So we can't be fully locked down. We need to have operations run, but where is that dynamic and under what circumstances does it shift to doing something versus not? Did you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what we were talking about, contextualizing risk. So when you're looking at, of course, the asset type, and then what is it functioning, what it network dependencies, does it have backups? Those are all things that we use when we're looking at what is the device and the criticality of actually doing something about it. But then when we're looking at that, the balance between security and operational functionality, I think, again, it depends on your environment. Can you afford to take the risk, or do you need to do something about it? So where do I see that compromise or risk acceptance? Usually it comes down to how you're going to react. So in some cases that reaction might be, actually doing a patch, but maybe there's other ways you can mitigate, because sending out a patch isn't the only way you can mitigate a risk. You can mitigate risk by, changing your network, securing your network in a different way. So there's always other options to mitigating risks. It doesn't always have to be something that might disrupt operations. So that's probably how I would answer.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. I think there we're going to go ahead and wrap for the day. We appreciate everybody coming. We know time is a very scarce commodity, especially in this particular individual market with the people that are typically on these calls. We hope it was worth your while. We welcome all feedback. And again, you will be getting a thank you follow-up if you wanted to respond with feedback from there. Maybe next webinar topics, more of this, less of that, what have you. But also a link to the recording and an invitation to our next webinar, August 27th. So with that, I will bid you adieu and thank you for spending some time with us. So I hope it was worth your while, and we'll see you next time.